Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to all of you in attendance at UN Day 2021, titled Fight Poverty, Not the Poor. We have three fabulous speakers with three different perspectives for you today, and I'm honestly thrilled to be opening this evening's proceedings. Before we begin, I would like to invite Father Roshan to lead us in prayer.
Good evening. Thank you to members of the UN Club for inviting me to commence this meeting with prayer. And so, very appropriate theme with the COVID situation. Let's ask God's blessings that not only what we speak and hear and learn this evening, but that in small ways, all of us will be able to contribute to alleviate poverty around the world. So let's look to God in prayer. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we praise you that you are the God who owns the whole universe. You have given us sufficient resources for all our needs. But often our selfishness and our greed prevent the earth's resources being shared by all. And currently, Father, in this COVID situation, around the globe, poverty has increased rapidly, with people, especially the common laborer, unable to go to work during lockdown, people who have lost jobs, businesses that have crashed, and even children without food. And so we thank you that the UN Club of STC Mount have chosen this particular theme. And Father, we pray that in a small way, all of us would be careful the way we use the blessings that you provide for us, not to waste, nor to have greed, and to be willing to share. And Lord, we thank you that we could think of the words of Jesus who said, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me. And you went on to say, Lord Jesus, whatever you did for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. So bless this evening's programs, be with the speakers, and may we be convinced that we need to be more part of the solution than the problem. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Father. We will now play a short video which introduces the topic for today's discussion.
Extreme poverty refers to people who live without being able to address their basic needs, and that includes access to water, access to sanitation, access to food. 836 million people today live on less than $1.25 a day, but if you look at a slightly bigger catchment, if you like, for poverty, people are living on less than $2 a day. That figure rises to 2.2 billion people. And if you take a slightly bigger figure yet again, use the figure of 8 people living on less than $8 a day, and we have half the world's population.
I now invite one of the project chairs, Nehan Sithampuram, to say a few words.
Thank you, Jonathan. One sir, one sir, our chief guest, Ms. Mark Bissar, distinguished guest speakers, students of the invited schools, and my fellow Thomians. It's both a privilege and an honor to address you all today and welcome you all to UN Day 2021. I would like to begin by welcoming our chief guest for this evening, Mr. Mark Bissar, tuning in all the way from Miami, Florida. It is indeed an honor, sir, to have someone of your caliber as our chief guest for today. We are also graced with the presence of two guest speakers, Ms. Aishani Medanangodalabe and Mr. Johann Rieber. On behalf of the club, I thank you both for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. Today focuses on our community, minorities living on the margins of society, without the strength to lift their head nor the hope to get through the day. Fight Poverty Not the Poor will talk about the unprecedented times we live in, how these measures are all the more relevant in the midst of a global pandemic which has crippled the international economy. The United Nations has set out 17 substantial development goals, and one that has the highest priority is that of no poverty. With more people falling below the poverty line, it is evident this goal needs long-term solutions immediately. And so, in light of government policies and ignorance, as young adults of tomorrow, it is imperative that we educate ourselves on the cause and remedies for the unacceptable reality. Finally, it is our hope that today stimulates a journey of understanding and change for many, if not all of you, as we work towards eradicating poverty and creating an equitable future for all. Thank you, Esther Perpetua.
Thank you, Nehan. And as Nehan mentioned, we have on our panel today Mr. Mark Bissar, Mr. Johann Rieber, and Ms. Aishani Medagangodalabe. Also, before we start, if I could ask the audience to please switch on your cameras, as I'm sure it would make it easier for the speakers to converse with the audience, so that would be greatly appreciated. I see a few more cameras coming on, that's great. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the first speaker for this evening. Joining us from Nepal today is Ms. Aishani Medagangodalabe. Ms. Medagangodalabe is the United Nations Development Programme's resident representative for Nepal. She holds a Master's of Science in Agroeconomics, Sociology, and Rural Development from the Faculty of Agriculture in Gemblot-Liege, Belgium. She is fluent in French and took up her new assignment on the 11th of April 2019. Ms. Medagangodalabe, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Good evening. Wanakam, Salaam Alaikum, and Namaste to all of you from Nepal. I think after Reverend Father Mendes' prayer and also the video, I think I can almost just conclude my remarks, because most of the conversation that I had prepared were like addressed in those different sessions. But I'm very, very happy. First of all, I want to thank the club and also Sashanka through Eshani to reach out to me, and also the whole organizing committee. And also to have given me this opportunity to speak to my fellow Sri Lankans from the foothills of Himalayas, very dear to many Sri Lankans because of Lumbini and other historical relationships, and to speak few words with my own experience. So just to start off, and I think Father Mendes referred to about COVID. Obviously, you're speaking about poor and poverty, and this COVID has come to us and reminded all of us that any of us, and any no matter what is the income levels of us, can feel that status of poverty at any moment, and can basically feel it at all of our inside the family, inside the society and the country, in the world, and no matter where they are. So basically, this has completely changed the discourse of poverty for us, at least for us, in the UN system. We were already very worried about how are we going to achieve the sustainable development goals that we said, all the member states said that we are going to achieve by 2030, and here comes we are with additional challenges. So my presentation was a little bit about poverty, a little bit about poor, and then to go directly to the three questions that I had been asked about from my experience in Nepal. What is basically the poverty situation in Nepal, the social barriers and the government actions? I think these were the three questions addressed to me. Before very quickly telling you what UNDP is doing, and then maybe asking you, I think again, Father Mendes said, we have to focus on the solutions. And I think that is where you, the young generation, can definitely be an asset to all of us. So this is my introduction. If we could go to the next slide. Yes, poverty, I think you all heard about it okay, the references I'm giving, it's from the United Nations documentation or the World Bank. And the photos I am using here are my own photos that I've taken in Nepal, or our UNDP colleagues, just to make sure. And I've chosen the photos in a way that also give a little bit of glimpses of this country, where poverty, we still have basically 5 million people in extreme poverty, and so that you can see what are the conditions in which they live, and who are the people that we basically speak about poverty: elderly, young people, women, and those who are really at the crunch. So yes, poverty is a status and a condition, and you heard Jesus Christ's words about water, about food, about visiting in the prison, about relationships, about having medicine. So this is about basic needs, and I think that is what is the status about. You can go to the next, yeah. The status about, yeah, thank you. And perhaps what we don't speak much is about the denial of choices or the opportunities that someone, a right duty bearer that we call in the UN language, someone who has a duty, perhaps is not working enough to make sure that a right holder like you and me and can get that right to food, right to education, right to health, and so forth. So it's a basically violation of human dignity, and that is the way that we pursue and perceive poverty in our work. It's also about feeling insecure. And I'm sure no matter how much money we have at a time, and I think maybe a few years ago, even in Sri Lanka, when tsunami happened, after tsunami, when the bombs went off, we felt insecure, we felt powerless. And some of us most probably felt excluded and from the communities. And that is also poverty. It's a status of poverty. And where the countries that I worked in before Nepal, I was in Algeria, and our UN office was targeted by a bomb, and we lost colleagues. And that is about conflict, the violent extremism, the conflict, and also the basically the natural disasters. When it comes to Nepal, 2050, every day there is a tremor in Nepal, earthquake, tremors, landslides, floods, fires, forest fires. Every day one person dies on average because of natural disasters. So these are stages of poverty that most of the time, if we look into, very difficult to capture. when in terms of the one before, the measurements, it's very, very difficult to capture. We could think, I mean, I'm sure you read about, you heard about the energy intake, so many calories are needed. If not, we are stunted, we are malnourished, and that is the type of poverty calculation and basic needs approach we just spoke about. Or also the capability approach, basically well-being and freedom to choose type of approaches. So there are many, many different types of approaches the scientists are proposing. But nevertheless, these approaches are always challenged because they use the households as a primary unit to look into poverty. And if you have a family of 5 people, if you speak to the head of the family, most of the time it's a man and the men headed households, the conveying of messages of that family will be biased. And we think because of this, globally, some 30% of information could be lost, that biasness of the male headed household. So these poverty measures, the way that we are capturing the essence of the concept is not holistic. In addition, we also know that these methods and approaches do not capture necessarily the relationships that we are lacking, particularly during the lockdown that we made reference, the absence of voice, that we can't take positions. And also the time use. I'm sure you ask today going home your mother that the number of hours they are spending in doing unpaid care work are not counted in this poverty measurements. So we know that whatever these measurements those are proposed are not necessarily comprehensive, but nevertheless they are useful because we can have comparable dimensions, comparable units among countries. So I think I would pass the next slide because the video spoke about the numbers, but as it said, there are roughly around 10% of poor in the country, extreme poor, who are living less than 400 Sri Lankan rupees a day, and that is what the number that we have today, and most of them in basically living in sub-Saharan Africa, that I'm sure you are aware of. Nevertheless, until last year, we know that also 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty, and for the last 30 years. So it's not the whole story is gloomy or that nothing had happened, and there are good results. And unfortunately, until COVID came and tapped on our door, people had been lifted. So what we know as of now is that there could be some 140, 120, 150 million additional people will become extreme poor by 2021, 2022 because of COVID. So that means we'll have to look in this poverty reduction measures through this angle, because these are what we call the new poor. I think I'll come back a little bit, although I think a reference was made to these people as well. So next slide, Rasendra. So let me quickly go to, so here are some slides from Nepal. When we speak about poverty, most of the time we look into the education, the health, and the income. So these are the 3 dimensions that UNDP and most of the time that we look into. But we're not looking into the other additional deprivations in terms of sanitation. You can see here, this is in Patan Square in Nepal, though if somebody had visited, so in the open square that people are having their access to sanitation, water for their clothes, washing and bathing and so forth, the firewood, the transport systems, and the school. The last slide is the school. You can see the level and the quality of the school. And on the left, during the COVID time, how the COVID patients were treated on the pavement of the hospital because they were not taken, there were no beds and there were no oxygen. So I think, so to give you these deprivations are not necessarily captured by the income poverty lines that we usually propose. So if I go to the next slide very quickly, in Nepal. So has the poverty situation in Nepal has become better or worse during the last 5 years? I think this is the question I was asked by Sashanka and the team. Nepal, it's a very diverse country. It's a country of 33 million people. It's a country of 125 different ethnic groups that are living in Nepal, including, if you haven't heard before, the group of Dalits, what we call Dalits, the untouchables, that are prohibited, banned, but yet many consequences are there for this group of people who we call Dalits. And language-wise, there are some 92 living languages in Nepal, and gender-wise, like in any country, disparities still exist. And leaving no one behind, that's the principle of the Sustainable Development Goal, has been quite well embraced in Nepal's constitution, and the government of Nepal has taken into many of their projects and programs and social spending, and has a very strong resonance of SDGs in the constitution of the Nepal, which is now a republic almost after 240 years of monarchy. Followed by conflict, armed violence conflict, and then passing through a transition period, and now a republic. So currently in Nepal, it has 761 governments, not only one government, it's not a unitary system, it is a federal system. That means there are all three levels of governments, all are quite independent and can make decisions independently. So within this context, and before COVID hit, if I go to the next slide, yes, poverty has been reduced. So this is, I would say, the good news. And if we, next slide, Sasenda. Yeah, so we can see here, all the lines are going up. Basically, the value of the Nepal's Human Development Index has come to 0.6, which is really putting the country into the medium human development category, and number 142 out of 189 countries. And when it comes to Sri Lanka is number 72. So you can roughly put into your head and compare what could be the level of poverty and the status of the development in Nepal compared to Sri Lanka. Nevertheless, between 1990 and 2019, the country has gained 55% of their status if we compare with 1990. So if I go to the next, so good story, yes, Nepal has improved. I think here I put the slide just to show you where Sri Lanka is. Of course, you know about it. Nepal is 0.602 and Sri Lanka 0.782. And you can see that while Nepalis now live 70 years almost, it has gained quite 16 years compared to 1990. And 12 years they go on average schooling, and 5 years for obviously for the adults education as well, and $3,457 that PPP per capita income, while a Sri Lankan would get 12,700 GNI per capita income. So just to give you a little bit of comparison to understand Nepal. Next slide, please. And here, so now again, I think why I put this slide is to show you that education, health, and income not enough. There are other deprivations, and you can see the ladies here who are traveling. Basically, they spend 2.5 to 3 hours every day collecting wood and water, and quite heavy, 10 kilograms they are carrying every day, and that is usually women who do this, and very, very common scan, the basically landscape that when you come to Nepal, going to mountains, that you see this. And you can see also the children walking to the schools. Why I put this is to show that after they walk for a few years, as soon as they complete their primary education, they drop out because these routes are very, very difficult. There are no public transport, and it's very heavy investment in terms of human nature. So they basically drop out in the secondary education, and mostly the girls. And then what happened is at the age of 13, 14, because it's a heavy burden on families, they get married. Then early pregnancies and so forth. So this vicious cycle of poverty is still present in Nepal, although that with the good story that they have reduced and lift roughly 3 million people out of poverty before the COVID happened. So just wanted to give you this multidimensional poverty and to understand a little bit how it affects kids, how it affects mostly women. Next. So going a little bit, again, even multidimensional poverty, if we compare, we see between 2014 and 2019, there is a huge decrease. And now we are roughly around 17 million. I think I mentioned this. We still have roughly 5 million people to whom that we need to, and government and all development partners will need to do some targeted programming. Going forward, I think I have 2-3 more slides, and then I will hand over. It's going. Yeah, so I spoke, the second question, breaking social barrier between poor, less fortunate, and the rich. So as I said, if you read anything about Nepal, because 125 different ethnic groups, because 92 different languages and religion, discrimination and exclusion are two words that come across in almost all the development literature. Ethnicity, caste, religion, gender, sexual orientation, age and disability, and all the social norms and harmful practices. These are really real, and the patriarchal social and cultural norms are very much perpetuated still in the rural Nepal. And this is definitely a social barrier and economic barrier for people to progress. And saying this, it's basically has also crossed from the family to the society to the institutions. So if you take an institution, a ministry, a department, a hospital, if you take the top positions, most of the time, obviously, they are occupied by certain ethnic groups, could be majority-wise, could be men, and so forth. So this is why it is important to mention that, and the power is unequal, and basically the marginalization that comes with it, no matter how much you change the laws, the policies, the strategies, no matter how much you bring the money, social spending, but these barriers exist in the heads of people. So therefore, unless and until the attitudes, the way of thinking are not changed, the pace of poverty alleviation is not going in the way that we have mentioned in 2030, 2050, and so forth. So these are real barriers in the case of Nepal. Next slide, I think, yeah. So just to give you a little bit of about the Dalits, the untouchables. The data as of 2011, and these are still debated, and 13% of Nepal population are Dalit population, basically. And as I said, the 40% of the Dalits is said to be below the poverty line. They don't have land, they don't have access to land. And basically, Dalit women are very much at the risk of sexual and domestic violence. and they don't have access to reproductive health care. And also they are basically, they are very much represented in the parliament since the last election, but nevertheless, the civil service is very, very weak in terms of Dalit presentation. And then the caste-based discrimination and intercaste marriage bring a lot of violence, bring a lot of early, basically falling in love with somebody other than a Dalit or another caste is completely not accepted, and it brings a lot of domestic violence and societal violence. And when a violence happens, they can't go to a police station and file a case. It would not be accepted. It would not be taken seriously. So basically, the access to justice, again, the dimensions of the poverty, and then you can see how they are all interconnected. The few numbers here: 74% are denied into the household or kitchen if you are a Dalit, basically, and 52% of using communal water taps or the hills, the wells. It is not possible for Dalits to go and use the community wells or the water taps. And they cannot, 50%, this is a survey done by the UN system, 50% of them say they are denied to go to any temple, any religious worshipping. They can't go, they're not accepted. And they cannot sell milk or dairy products, even they cannot. So these are related to the religious connotation, traditional, the culture, traditions, so well ingrained that these are being perpetuated, even though the laws and the regulations in the country are going against them. But in the minds of people, this is how it happens. The next slide will give you a little bit, Shashanka or Talib, you will have to tell me when I'm going a little bit over time. Here I want to say that the Dalits, among the Dalits, again, you have some 30 different types of Dalits. If you are coming from the hills, if you are coming from the plain, you are very different. So again, it's not that it's all harmonious within the same community of Dalits. And we can see the poverty incidence. If you are Dalit, no matter hill or no matter plain, they are high because of the access to land that we spoke about. The income they get, low because they are Dalits. And last thing here I want to refer is as a breaking the social barrier is about the bonded labor and slavery. So there are groups, although banned since 2002, 2008, these are people, they still continue the landlord system. So their whole families are indebted to the landlords, and because they have taken a loan, so they spend all their life working the rice, the paddy and other agricultural land to these landlords, and they don't sometimes get any fee back. It's just because they had taken loan, and there are historical reasons to continue this bonded labor. So these are the type of things that UN system is working, and these are prohibited. If you go to the law, there are acts and rules and regulations which say that bonded labor is to be banned. But nevertheless, the implementation, I think we'll come back to it in 2 minutes, is that it is not really happening. So you see the slopes of the mountains where people have to grow their crops. It's not that easy. It's not that plain. Next one, Rasendra. And last one in this social barriers is about the women. They are mostly in the 4 lowest paid sectors: agriculture, wholesale retail, accommodation and food service, and domestic workers of the private household. So it's still quite a larger amount of women. And I think I mentioned about the number of hours they walk to bring this water and firewood and the hurdling and everything that they do every day. And these works are not counted in the poverty measures that we have. Next one. So the the harmful practices, I just want to mention here one thing quite common in Nepal, yet although it is being prohibited, is the menstruation. When menstruation happens to the girls, they are not supposed to be with the others. They have to go out and live in a small hut. And this is still happening. It's in certain provinces quite present, and there are so many incidents happening because it's like in the fridge in some provinces, like 4 degrees, less than 4 degrees. And living in those kinds of huts when it is 4 degrees outside and putting a bit of fire can completely take your life if you are not careful, and this is happening regularly. So what I want to then it's completely, they become untouchable during this time, and most of the young girls are suffering enormously because of this harmful practice, which is called in Chaupadi in Nepal. And of course, there are rules, again, regulations put in place by the government, but unfortunately, traditions are quite stronger, and some families, although they are against Chaupadi, they continue to practice this at home. Next one. So does the government help poverty? Definitely. I speak about poverty alleviation. I take it as such. International commitments, they are all being followed. Federalism, they did the unitary system to federal system. So meaning that there is a way to bring the basic services close to the people. Programs, inclusive development, targeting women, Dalits and different Janajatis and Madeshis in the plain, and progressive laws. There are quota systems introduced, and we have some 700, for example, deputy mayors in the country, and whereas the 700 plus mayors, laws, everything is there, but nevertheless, unfortunately, implementation only happens, those who are in charge of implementation are also convinced about these rules and regulations and monitoring, and it is happening. So in terms of targeted actions, and I think this is where I would invite you, it's not enough to be equal, giving the same thing to everyone. Everyone would benefit from the same support. It's good, it's a good step, but you can see the third person, he still can't see the match going on. So that's equality. It's important, it's good, but not enough. And equity, again, basically do some affirmative actions. Yes, it could happen. Then you can target, you can make sure that the poor get that equity. But nevertheless, what we are looking for in terms of poverty reduction, at least here in Nepal, is to completely remove the barrier, which is the third photograph here you see, is that basically systemic barriers that need to be removed, that all of us to come together so that the justice for, in this case, the poor and women and Dalit and the marginalized are being prioritized. So this is basically the vision that we have in terms of the working with the government of Nepal at all three levels, plus the development partners, so that the Dalits and the marginalized can claim some of the rights that they have in terms of access to basic needs. Going to the last slide, I think. Rasendra? Yes. So in terms of us, I think I've covered this. We basically work on the SDGs, but currently repurposing most of our work on the COVID and the vaccination, and to make sure that the vaccine equity is there, and in terms of gender equality, and obviously the net zero commission, the greenhouse gas emission by 2050, although Nepal is not a contributor, but basically putting people at the first for equitable recovery. And we in UNDP, we are planning globally, not only here in Nepal, in terms of poverty, to help people, and the target is 100 million people escape multidimensional poverty. and clean energy meaning, clean cooking, basically for women. That is something also that we would like to prioritize, and also good governance, elections and good governance, participation and giving voice, and obviously leveraging some trillions for SDG realization. And that is our vision for UNDP globally. And I think you can go to the next and the last. Yes, so for you and youth, that is how I looked at. And my question were that what are the things that you think, and you are today in the United Nations, and tomorrow you might be the public service and working for public goods. As youth, how to engage and to put the people at the center. And I think to not to borrow too much from the future, and that is looking after the planet, and to be in solidarity with countries like Nepal and in the region, in the sub-region, and also in the country, other continent, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. What are the things that you could do in terms of bringing together the good things from Sri Lanka and other countries together, and how to plant the seeds of peace? And I think Reverend Father mentioned about the mind, peace. What does it really mean? And prosperity, instead, when we invest, how to influence our governments when they do investments, and when they do large investment, large constructions, large transport, large energy programs, that they go a little bit green. How do but not basically completely changing at the same time everything, but how do we make sure that transition is smooth, and that speaks to all people in the country. So these are type of things that we are looking at, and these are the 5 P's of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goal Principles. And I think I would like you to invite to reflect on that, and going forward, make sure that these are all become part of your contribution to your generation and your future generation. I think I've done right. It is so thank you. Perhaps I went ahead a little bit of time, but yes. And lastly, and not least, but I would like to welcome anyone who would like to come to Nepal and to do any internship, any exchange with the Nepali youth, and either virtually or in person. Nepal is now open, and you're most welcome to come and visit Nepal. So thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Ms. Medaganguri, and don't worry at all. That was quite an informative dive into the topics. That was appreciated. And we have also received a few additional questions apart from what you've answered, but I believe you touched on one of them, how the minority community gets marginalized and how poverty is distributed like that. So moving on to our next question, it is, because of the COVID-19 situation, and as well as the restrictions placed on importing items to Sri Lanka, many of the citizens in rural and urban areas are facing difficulties in obtaining essential items to satisfy their hunger. What solutions and steps can be taken in order to solve this issue? If you just a brief answer.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
You are audible, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I think Nepal went to lockdown on the 23rd of March, 2020. Immediately when they got the first case, lockdown was imposed almost for 6 months. And by the time COVID was declared in Nepal, Nepal had only one laboratory to do a PCR test. And today they have 100 plus laboratories. So just to show you that how can you go from very simple things that you have, but if you're prioritizing that it could happen. In terms of confirmed cases, in Nepal we have 700,000 cases, 7 lakhs, almost 8 lakhs. And in Sri Lanka, I think it's 5 lakhs as of this morning, if my data is correct in front of me. Basically, Nepal deaths is 11,000, and I think Sri Lanka already past 12,000, if if I'm correct, right? But in terms of vaccination, what is interesting is that Nepal had been asking for how they manage. They manage the lockdown. We are still working from home. All of us, we are still working from home in the UN system virtually, and the schools closed. 35,000 schools were closed. 8 million kids were out, and very few had access to internet. And don't forget that Nepal is a mountainous country, right? 8 out of 10 highest mountains in the world, including Everest, that's in Nepal, right? The Himalayas so basically the people initially, they all followed very closely, and I think that investment paid back. And vaccination, currently Nepal has vaccinated roughly around 20+% compared to 50%, I think, in Sri Lanka. Nevertheless, the measures are being followed. I think, no, you cannot go anywhere in the country without seeing people masking and so on. The only issue that we have, I think Father Mendes mentioned, it's about the tourism sector. We were expecting in 2021 to have 1 million plus tourists, and it's 8% of the GDP of the country, and that all tourists, and nobody came to Nepal, and that is a huge loss. And in addition, Nepal got 500,000, 500,000 of Nepalese came back. The migrants, they were all working in the Gulf or in Malaysia or in Korea. They all came back. So these are most of the time low skills migrants, and now you have to find jobs. So currently, if you ask me about how to handle this, this is about, at least for UNDP, we are doing a short-term employment program for the tourism sector job losers. That means guides, the porters, the rafters type of people who absolutely lost all jobs. We are giving them few days of jobs, and with the National Tourism Board, and trying to keep them busy with maintaining the tourism infrastructure, basically the tourism rural infrastructure. Cases are going down. The hospitals are functioning, even though with very sometimes limited facilities, limited human resources. Nevertheless, all of us, and I think this is where we all have to come together, is the vaccination, to vaccinate everyone, because unless everyone is safe, not everyone is safe, as I think our leaders are putting it. So it's about vaccination. So we all push for vaccination. And UN system, we did 10,000 vaccination within 2 months. All our partners and government of Nepal helped us to get our colleagues, partners, and dependents all vaccinated. So now we are back to the field. Basically, from this week, we will be going back to the field and making sure that the frontliners, not for the health, but frontliners for the jobs, will be busy as much as the health system. Not sure whether I responded to your question, but over to you.
That was great. That was fine. Also, I have received a few questions in chat, so don't worry. We will answer them if time allows at the end. So for now, please do direct your questions to Shashankar or to Nehan Sitamparam, and if time permits, we will move on to them. So, and now it is my pleasure to introduce to the stage the second speaker for this evening, Mr. Johann Rieber. Mr. Rieber is the Deputy Country Representative for the Asia Foundation, and he joined the foundation in 2014 and works on issues of social cohesion and community security. Mr. Rieber has a master's degree in conflict resolution from the University of Bradford, UK. He is also on the board for the Center for Poverty Analysis based in Colombia. Mr. Rieber, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, and you can see the slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. Let me just move this out of the way. So good evening to everybody, and thank you very much to the UN Club for the invitation to speak. particularly to Jonathan for reaching out to me directly, and to Nehan and the team. I don't often get a chance to speak to young people, so this is really a privilege, and so please do excuse me if I make any errors. I'd like to also acknowledge Father Roshan and the opening prayer that he kindly made at the beginning. I'll start by saying that my focus is really on social cohesion and peace building. That's really my background in Sri Lanka. So I'm looking at poverty very much from that perspective. I will speak for about 15 minutes, I hope, and then turn it back to Jonathan. And I think I'm very happy to be speaking also following Miss Aishani and the very comprehensive presentation and overview of poverty that she gave, but also looking forward to hearing from Mr. Bissar and his very practical experience of working on issues around poverty and humanitarian response. So I'm very honored actually to be on this panel. So my presentation, my talk, I'll cover these themes very briefly. But poverty in Sri Lanka, very quickly to take a look at that. And, you know, as Ms. Saishani also mentioned, everything right now is viewed through the lens of the pandemic, so that has an impact on everything we're looking at right now. So understanding the impact of the pandemic on poverty and the resulting impact on social cohesion. And this is an issue that Ms. Aishani spoke about as well. And then finally, I'd like to reflect on what we can do, as the UN Club, as young people. I'll take a slightly different approach in that as young people, and I refer to myself as still being young, I hope, we need to be sensitive to the needs of those less privileged or in need. And so we need to look inward as well. We need to look at our own values and how they sit in the current context. Not only action on what we can do, and I think we're very focused on action and meeting the need that exists, but also ultimately on who we are. So not only about what we can do, but also about who we are. So I'll start by giving you a quick snapshot of what the level of poverty is in Sri Lanka, and the Poverty Headcount Index, which measures the proportion of the population that is under the national poverty line, was 4.1% in 2016. So I apologize for the graphic here, it's not very clear, but you can see this steady decline, 4.1 in 2016 compared to 15.2% in 2006-07, and almost 29% in 1995-96. So when you look at it from an income poverty point of view, and particularly looking at the national poverty line, there seems to have been quite a significant reduction over time. And of course, this information is from the Department of Census and Statistics, and they have a great website that you can go and explore all this data. But in August 2021, which is just a couple of months ago, the national poverty line stood at 5,353 rupees per person per month. So this is kind of the minimum bundle of goods, mostly food, that one person would need to survive for 1 month. So looking at that amount, 5,353 for one person, you can understand what some of the challenges are. And but whichever economic indicator you look at for Sri Lanka, generally poverty seems to have come down quite significantly. But what do we feel about this? Is this painting a real or an accurate picture? And is this picture changing after the pandemic? Could we see this indicator shifting up, moving up? And so while this is a national average, there remain, of course, pockets of deep poverty around the country at district level, at divisional level, at village level, with differences in both the urban and the rural settings. So the cost of living being quite stark and different in urban areas, in towns and cities, as against in the rural area, out in the villages and in the rural areas. So just a quick snapshot there of poverty, but from a very economic income perspective. And how else can we understand poverty in Sri Lanka as well? And Ms. Saishani spoke to this as well, that it's not only from an economic sense, but often those in poverty are also impacted by many inequalities and other what we call dimensions of poverty. So we often use this term multidimensional poverty. And people in poverty often have poor access to health systems. You can see overcrowded health systems these days, and especially those who rely on public health systems, and often the poor and those that's the most vulnerable or most disadvantaged have real challenges in terms of gaining access and the hidden costs of the public health systems as well. The lack of basic education, I would say in Sri Lanka generally our basic education is quite good, but again we have pockets around the country in more deprived areas where it's very difficult to get human or physical resources that children would enjoy in other parts of the country. And then of course the lack of the other sanitary or housing, poor living conditions that people in poverty often find themselves in. So while looking at the economic side, income, livelihoods, it's also important for us to understand the other dimensions of poverty and how they exist in Sri Lanka as well. And so how has the pandemic impacted on poverty or low-income groups? And we see this all around us. And these dimensions of poverty that I just mentioned have really been exacerbated quite deeply due to the pandemic. A study by UNICEF from May 2020, so that's just at the very beginning of the lockdowns last year, a study by UNICEF showed that 71% of households in Sri Lanka experienced either complete or partial loss in income, so 71% of households, which is very significant. And potential income losses at the household level are higher across towns and cities than in rural areas. So these lower levels of income has a serious effect on living standards and well-being across the board. With regards to education, and you might recognize this photograph from the newspapers, from online sites, you see these children up in a tree trying to get a good reception on their mobile phones to be able to follow their online classes. And so, a survey in 2018 showed that only 52% of Sri Lankan households with school-aged children owned a smartphone or computer, essential for online learning. And only 40% had an internet connection, primarily via mobile phones. So this means that less than half of all households in Sri Lanka can benefit from e-learning opportunities. So the things that we take for granted every day, many children across our country see as a luxury. And finally, just to quickly mention as well that the rise of patients during the third wave of the pandemic most recently, stretched the capacity of treatment facilities and overwhelmed the health system. Hospitals had reached full capacity, and hopefully that is now gradually or slowly reducing with increased workload and even with healthcare workers becoming infected. So this has an impact on the usual services provided for those who would need healthcare for many other conditions, for what we call non-communicable diseases such as heart attack or diabetes or injury. So, and of course the poor and the vulnerable often end up being at the back of the queue. So we don't yet know the full cost in terms of those who may have got more sick or even died due to not being able to access healthcare services. And I hope that in time we'll be able to better understand these challenges. So the pandemic has had a huge impact on the poor and the most vulnerable, exacerbating the challenges that they anyway would face. And so in addition to that, what has been the social cost of the pandemic and the impact on social cohesion. And this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, an issue that I look at more closely in my work with the Asia Foundation. And so, of course, we've heard of certain groups being stigmatized, including those who are the most vulnerable. So we've heard a lot about the daily wage earners, sanitary workers. For example, there's been discrimination against certain groups thought to be at high risk. If you remember, garment workers about a year ago, migrant workers who returned to Sri Lanka from overseas, some who were carrying the virus, even the Navy at one point, and even healthcare workers, who have not been able to sometimes even stay in their places of residence close to hospitals, as landlords discontinue their rent. So even healthcare workers have faced discrimination. So we've also seen discrimination against certain ethnic or religious groups with restrictions placed on some religious practices. And in part, this has been driven by what we now term misinformation or disinformation, and terms I'm sure that you hear more and more of fake news, which is the more common term, that seeks to be more divisive, keep people apart and suspicious of each other. And so this just adds another layer, another dimension to challenges faced by those who are anyway more vulnerable to these kind of shocks. So given all of this, sometimes we wonder what it is that we can do and how can we help. We can certainly mobilize, we can advocate, we can find ways to tangibly support those most affected and those in most need. But how do we sustain this in an increasingly difficult economic climate? And we know that Sri Lanka is going through a real big economic challenge right now. These kinds of efforts are always difficult and a challenge. And so perhaps one way is through education, not only in the formal sense, not only in terms of formal education, being able to go to school, but also in the informal sense, where young people can move out of poverty and be upwardly mobile, as we say, and also focus on soft skills or life skills. And we know that the future of work, I think as all of you grow up, work will look very different. And for all children, work will look very different. We'll have a real focus on soft skills, of being able to be flexible, being able to adapt, as much as on the technical education one might receive. So as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, I want to share just one perspective that could lead to wider and what we call systemic change. So it's an approach that requires us to look inward. It needs some personal reflection and introspection, and of course would run parallel to many humanitarian and developmental efforts that seek to lift people out of poverty. These are all important approaches, but action really starts from within and from within us. And so do values that are mentioned here, such as compassion, tolerance, respect, honesty, cooperation, and of course, peace, and importantly, active listening as a skill. Can these values empower us to be more empathetic and understanding of each other's needs? Through education on these soft skills or these life skills, is there a way to reduce inequalities and discrimination by promoting common, shared, and widely accepted values? So through a small project, the Asia Foundation, we developed a values curriculum that focuses on these values in particular. And these values were developed through discussion and consensus with religious leaders from across all communities in Sri Lanka. During this pandemic, we have adapted this curriculum to include activities that seek to address some of the stigmatization and discrimination that has arisen. And I'm happy to share a link to this curriculum in the chat box. There's now all sorts of things, Facebook page and Instagram, platforms that you all will be very familiar with, and I encourage you to engage with this content. But we've taken advantage really of social media and understanding the difficulties and the challenges around social media, but also the opportunities that it provides in terms of addressing these issues. So we've used social media to build interest in values education. And we need these messages to reach out to young people. You really are the future generation of decision makers, of politicians, of public servants, professionals, business people, healthcare workers, and so on. So I'd like to share just very quickly as I come towards the end of my presentation, some content from this campaign that we rolled out during the pandemic for you to get a sense of the messaging. So keeping an air of respect, making compassion contagious, staying safe, staying united, being immune to intolerance, and we need to think of each other. You know, what we do will impact on each other, and so we will only get out of this if we work together. And finally, a post that I really liked was, COVID doesn't discriminate, and neither should we. And if we look at the ethnic distribution of COVID-19 cases in Sri Lanka, they're all Sri Lankans. And so, just as I wrap up, I want to share that these values that I just mentioned should underpin everything you do as the UN Club and as a society. And these values align very well with the UN values of integrity, professionalism, and respect for diversity. And so some final thoughts, and I've tried to be brief, but just to leave you with some final thoughts and some questions. In that we need to understand deeply how current challenges exacerbate poverty. I think if we want to know how to respond to this challenge, if we want to know how to respond in a relevant and appropriate manner, we certainly need to look around, we need to read, we need to talk to people, we need to understand how poverty looks like and how it currently manifests, and the problems and challenges that those who are most vulnerable face. So knowledge and understanding is critical. We need to seek ways for us to engage, to support, and contribute to reducing poverty. And I think this is very much what the UN Club is all about. And I can see from your website and your work and your projects, this is the core at what you do. And I congratulate you and encourage you to continue that work. But fighting poverty also requires reform to sustain change. And reform is needed in education. We need economic reform, social welfare programs, and the Samurdhi program, if you're aware of in Sri Lanka, these are the kind of programs that actively need reform. And long-term reform is needed to lead to really sustainable and deep change. And so going back to the point I made earlier, values such as respect, tolerance, compassion, honesty, cooperation, and working together, these are the basis for being more empathetic and understanding others' perspectives and others' life situations. So on reflection, can values education also be a step towards reducing inequalities that drive poverty? Do we need to do more to look inward, to build this empathy that will enable sustainable and meaningful action, particularly as young people who will grow into this world where you will be the decision makers? And this sustainable and meaningful action will be needed to resolve critical challenges such as poverty. So I will stop there, and I want to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about talk about poverty from a slightly different perspective, from a perspective of values and the need for values education. But it has been a real privilege to speak, and I'd like to wish the UN Club of STC all the very best in your future endeavors. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Rieber, indeed for a very different perspective of poverty and also just basic things that we can do that can make a difference. So we will now have an interval of a brief interval. And so please do stick around as we will recommence the event shortly with our chief guest and final speaker for the night, Mr. Mark Bissar, joining us from Miami, Florida.
Imagine what it's like to live in extreme poverty. You have to think about the basics like your next meal all the time. An extremely poor family mostly has access only to the food that they grow themselves. If you have a bad harvest, one of your animals gets sick, you're going to have a period where you're not getting enough food. Daughters in these families have to gather water and wood. They have to cook dinners on an open fire with lots of smoke, and then they have to clean everything up. If they get a chance to do schoolwork at all, it's going to be very late at night. They need a lamp, if they have it, to be able to do that work. So the upshot is, if you're extremely poor, your time and energy really goes to mere survival. Is poverty inevitable? The answer is no. We asked 2,000 people on what they thought was going on with poverty. We told them the 1990 number and asked them to guess where it had gone. And their guess was that it had fallen from that 36% down to 22%. In fact, the real line is far, far better. It drops all the way down to 9%. That means since 1990, 1.2 billion people have overcome extreme poverty. As the economist Max Roser has said, the newspapers could have run a headline, "Number of people in poverty fell by 137,000 since yesterday," every single day for 25 years, and been right. Real news. According to the World Bank, this extreme poverty definition we use is a cutoff of about $1.90 per day or less. Getting out of extreme poverty is not the end goal. We want people lifted up way beyond extreme poverty, but it's really the start that gets things going, that gets countries on the way to self-sufficiency and moving towards middle income. So this is not just about the individuals, it's also about the countries themselves. A single dot is representing 1 million people. Right now, you're seeing the number of dots that represent the number of people who overcame poverty since 1990. It's really great to see how we made that incredible reduction, because it hints, okay, what remains? What do we have to do in the future? The progress came really in two great waves. The first wave was China. In 1990, 66% of people in China were extremely poor. So you can see all the dots there, each representing, again, 1 million people. But over just a short period, 15 years, their extreme poverty declined by over 500 million. The improvement in people's lives there is one of the most astonishing examples of progress in world history. The second wave came in India. Progress there started later, and it's been more gradual, but it's also an impressive trend. India went from 400 million people in extreme poverty in 2005 to just under 100 million today. And over the next several decades, that number is going to drop quite a bit. So the question we face here is, can we create a third great wave of poverty reduction in the rest of the world that will bring extreme poverty near to eradication? It's not going to be easy. We can go back to our dots, again, looking at each one representing 1 million people, but now we're going to look at the people.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Fight Poverty and Not the Poor. I hope you found that break video quite informative. Well, it was indeed a bit alarming. I am bewildered, and yes, what are we going to do about it? Remember, Fight Poverty, Not the Poor is a place where we are going to be empowered to understand and truly feel the plight of the poor, and of course, reveal the cause for their poverty, and yes, fight against the cause. And as our third and final speaker, we have Mr. Mark Dessar, who is joining us all the way from the US. Having done business in at least 43 countries, Mr. Dessar has had ample exposure to working conditions, labor practices, and the welfare of workers across the globe. In the course of his work, he has spoken on sourcing, international trade, and the best practices aimed at creating fair, safe, and secure working conditions for all workers. Mr. Dessar has indeed been a refuge for the helpless, and I assure you that after his speech, you will be compelled to be the voice of the poor. Mr. Dessar, the mic is now yours.
Ayubowan, namaste. Good evening to everybody in Sri Lanka, or good morning to me here in Miami. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to address this gathering of interested, motivated, engaged, committed, and talented young people in Sri Lanka. You know, Sri Lanka is a country that should be proud of itself. As the previous speaker, Rieber, pointed out, in the last 2 decades, you all have made tremendous progress to reduce the extreme poverty in Sri Lanka. But around the world, it still continues. And a lot of progress that was made in almost every country around the world, including the developing and developed countries, was reversed by the COVID in 2020. So the UNDP representative from Nepal gave an excellent lecture. You know, I was enthralled. I could not divert my attention as I normally get distracted, but everything that she shared regarding social exclusion, cultural factors, etc., were tremendous. I was going to touch on some of those. So fortunately, I hopefully will be able to skip and address some other factors for you all today. What does poverty mean to each one of us? You know, we all see poor people begging in the streets, tattered clothes, not having enough food. In the US, you have people with little cardboard signs saying, you know, I need work, I need money, I need food, etc., etc. So poverty is not something that is exclusive to the developing world or to the poorer countries. It is there everywhere, in the richest countries in the world and in the poorest countries in the world. And we have always been fighting poverty. For centuries, humanity has been fighting poverty. And why haven't we eradicated poverty? We've put men on the moon. Now we're having commercial space flights. We're sending missions to Mars and to Saturn, but we can't fix things here on Earth. What's wrong with us? You know, I was an executive in a multinational retail company. I've done that most of my life. And I was focused on making sure that workers in the apparel industry are taken care of, that the factories abide by the laws in which they live, that they receive the wages they're supposed to receive, they get their overtime wages, they get the benefits, etc. And I thought I was doing my job pretty well. And we had all the right corporate social responsibilities, the terms of engagement, and vendor compliance codes, etc. But then there was an incident in 2010, an earthquake in Haiti. And about the time it's going to take me to finish this sentence, in 45 seconds. That's all the time that that earthquake lasted. In that 45 seconds, about 230,000 people died. The country was in a shambles. They didn't have much infrastructure to begin with. And after the earthquake, it was devastating. The roads were blocked. We couldn't get to the right places. Hotels collapsed. There was no place to stay. People's houses were declared unsafe to stay in. So by fate or destiny or a series of events, I had to move from working in the private sector with a retailer to working for the US Department of State in Washington, D.C. It started a whole new journey for me. And it showed me that although I was aware of poverty and doing from the business and corporate point of view what was required for poverty, there were other dimensions and facets of poverty to which we were completely blind. So I'd like to touch on some of those things today. And we often hear that, the efforts to fight poverty are not working. The UN did this, or the World Bank did that, and the IMF is not successful. But there are many success stories. And I would like to spend some more time talking about those success stories also. And poverty, every school student, every college student, every corporate student tries to do something about it today, whether it is working in an NGO or a nonprofit organization, serving meals to the poor, having literacy classes, doing some work on the weekend, etc., to help poor people. All that is good, but that is not enough. It's the difference between giving a man a fish and teaching a man how to fish. If you give somebody a hot meal and a pair of shoes, a t-shirt and a pair of jeans, you've given them something which has a limited lifetime. The meal will keep that person going for the next 8 hours and then they're hungry again. The shoes and the clothes will keep them going for a few more months. It's nice. But how do we make these people self-reliant? In order to do that, your fight against poverty has to be intrinsic. As Rieber mentioned, it has to be part of your values, your core values, your culture, your social structure. Until it's not a part of our thinking and not an extracurricular activity, but a mainstream activity, poverty will continue. So can we go to the next slide, please? Or the next. Yeah. So what is the definition of poverty? By the way, all the slides and the PowerPoint presentation that I've created, they will be available to you. I've asked the organizers of the event to be free to share them to anybody that wants them. There's many definitions of poverty. There is the state of being extremely poor. As I said, you go to a depressed economic district, or here in the US now, you see people even at traffic intersections begging. They simply don't have clean clothes. The clothes are tattered. The hair is not been washed. They haven't bathed. So the state of being extremely poor is one that reflects the person doesn't have enough resources to keep body and soul together. That is one definition of poverty. Then in our language, we use the word poor as something referring to inferior quality. We say, my phone is poor quality, or my laptop is not working well. Quality is not good. Then there is poverty that is self-imposed voluntarily. If you look among religious groups, priests, nuns, monks, sadhus, fakirs, all these people, they take on sometimes vows of poverty. They renounce all material possessions. That is a poverty that they assume, hoping that it will help them on their spiritual journey. The kind of poverty that we are looking at is essentially the poverty that refers to lacking enough resources to provide the necessities of life: food, clean water, shelter, and clothing. But in today's world, that can be extended to include access to healthcare, education, and even transportation. If we stop and think for a moment, we have almost 100 people, I think, logged into this event. Could a poor person log into this event? If they don't have a phone, they don't have a smartphone or a computer or Wi-Fi or the internet, how can they do it? So poverty also includes lack of opportunities. All of you are college students. This event was advertised and circulated by the St. Thomas College to other schools and colleges, and people were invited. If you're not in a school or a college and you're a poor person, you wouldn't even have got the invitation. So educational poverty creates unintended consequences. You have no skills, you have no knowledge, no education, and you have less opportunities in terms of job. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Can we go to the next slide, please? So let's for a moment look at the meaning of poverty. What does poverty mean? There is no universal, single accepted meaning of poverty. The concept of poverty, as the lady from the UNDP, Johann Rieber, mentioned, is different in different societies. It's rooted in the values, and it obeys the particular logic of individual countries. When drawing up strategies to tackle poverty, many international agencies and government adopt anti-poverty measures based on an individual's income or purchasing power. According to this viewpoint, a poor person would be anyone whose per capita income or buying power within a household or family is below the minimum considered essential for meeting basic human needs. This minimum is widely known as the poverty line. Talking about what does poverty mean? Poverty means different things to different people. Yeah. Poverty, as Rupert and Aishani before him said, they're multifaceted and multidimensional. What does poverty mean to a child who is orphaned by AIDS or abandoned by his or her father? It means he may have received HIV at birth. In many countries, children like that. In Africa today, there are countries that are being ruled by warlords, and the government has broken down their failed states. These children have no choice but to become a child soldier. It could also mean extreme vulnerability and greater risk of exploitation. It leads to human trafficking and human slavery. These are consequences of poverty. Do they have the mental capacity to figure out their way or plan their way and navigate their way out of these human trafficking and slavery in situations in which they are entrapped? Most of them do not. Once they are immersed in that, they don't have a phone, they don't have internet, they don't have access to the outside world. What are they going to do? That is abject poverty. According to some UN statistics I saw, there's nearly 356 million children around the world living in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is anyone living under $1.90 a day. I think in Sri Lankan rupees, that would be about 380 rupees per day. So this is the extreme poverty figure. But it is estimated that almost 1 billion children live in multidimensional poverty, which means that they lack basic necessities like clean water or nutrition. If you all are interested, there is an excellent book written by a professor from Oxford. His name is Paul Collier, and he's written a book called The Bottom Billion. This talks about 1 billion people in the world that are falling behind, while the rest of the world, with digital technology, with artificial intelligence, with social media, with neural networks, machine learning, etc. Those who have the resources are moving forward, but those who are poor and left behind are not just falling behind. He uses the word, those groups are falling apart. And we have to do something about them, because if not, it could lead to social chaos and other highly undesirable and unintended consequences. Now, people fall ill due to unsafe water and poor sanitation. Another dimension of poverty is malnutrition. This leads to stunted growth. And the previous speakers talked about that. With stunted growth, there is an impact on the person's intelligence, physical properties like strength, coordination, and their ability to deal with the world in general. Educational poverty, lack of access to education, leads to depressed future productivity, lower efficiencies, lower ability to earn incomes, and inadequate healthcare. We've seen during COVID, even countries that had adequate healthcare, or what we would consider the best healthcare systems in the world, were not enough. Now, if they weren't enough for people who have resources, have jobs, and are able to manage under normal circumstances, then what about those who are poor and living in poverty? Let's go to the next slide, please. So the multidimensional poverty, or the Human Development Index, as it's also known, is something created by the United Nations, and it's also used by the World Bank and the IMF. There's 10 main dimensions there: nutrition, child mortality, the number of years of schooling, the number of children in school attendance, cooking fuel. In Haiti, where I did a lot of work, one of the problems is deforestation. Due to drought, or sometimes due to floods, farmers started losing their crops. If they have no crops to harvest, they have nothing to sell, they have nothing to sell, they have no income, what are they going to do? And people start chopping down trees. They burn the wood to convert it into charcoal, and they try to sell that charcoal for an income. But the consequence of that is, when you start chopping down trees, you have deforestation. You have deforestation, it leads to another cycle where, again, you don't have rain, you have only drought. So those countries that are poor, unless they have the resources and the help, they fall into the poverty traps, which help them, or not help them, but dump them or pull them deeper into that poverty cycle. So besides cooking fuel, there's sanitation, drinking water, availability of electricity. Without electricity, what do? How do you cook? You use charcoal again. The more charcoal you use, the more someone has to chop down trees in order to make that charcoal, which means there'll be more deforestation. Without electricity, you're not going to have access to the internet. You're not going to be able to charge your phone. You can't study at night. You can't watch the news. Housing and shelter. Most of the poor people are very often not able to buy a property. I mean, they are not bankable. They don't have banking accounts. They can't go to a bank and get a loan. So what do? They use whatever materials they can. In countries, they use pieces of wood, zinc sheets, etc. And these houses are not safe. And they're not healthy either. So with poor ventilation and unsanitary conditions, if your housing is not good, what's going to happen? You're going to fall sick. You fall sick, you don't have access to healthcare. Assets. People living at under $3 a day, not just $1.90, but $3 a day, the ones that we call moderately poor. They live from day to day. They live from meal to meal. They can't own any assets. They don't have the money to save. They don't have the assets. And if you don't have the assets, what do? You continue to be in poverty. So let's go to the next slide, please. The types of poverty. Let's focus on just a few: the health poverty, economic poverty, social and environmental poverty. Health poverty may sound strange, but there are many people around the world who don't know the importance even of brushing their teeth or making sure to drink water that is clean. You still have waterborne disease like cholera and the typhoid, etc., which prevail mostly in the poorer colonies or communities around the world. In 2010, as I said, there was an earthquake in Haiti and thousands of people were left homeless. When they were left homeless and living in tents, hygiene was poor and people didn't pay attention to the quality of drinking water. They took water, whether it was from wells, or taps, or rivers, or lakes, and unfortunately, it led to an outbreak of cholera. So besides the earthquake, or in the aftermath of the earthquake, there was a waterborne disease and there was a cholera epidemic, which led to the deaths of 40,000 people over and above the 230,000 people that died in the earthquake. This is a sad and stunning example of health poverty. Economic poverty. Almost half the world lives with a household income below $2.50 per day. This level of poverty is the equivalent of slavery. People need an income level that allows them to purchase what they cannot make or grow. And economic poverty drives people to desperate actions. There are countries in which people go and negotiate with the parents to buy their children. Sometimes those children are adopted, sometimes in worse conditions, those children are made or subject to slavery. Some of them are made to work in prostitution. It's very sad. Then we have environmental poverty. Our physical surroundings, climate, water supply, housing, and land, they all affect our well-being. And the circumstances of absolute poverty include extreme environmental risk. From insect and waterborne illnesses to extreme weather conditions such as drought and flooding. The spirits, hope, and health of the poor are depressed by the environment they live in. Going back to a place where I spent a lot of time, Haiti. Driven by doubt, farmers had no crops, no harvest to sell, and they start chopping down trees, like I said earlier. The lack of trees creates further doubt of soil erosion. And that affects the rain cycle of unproductive land, and poverty was further entrenched and consolidated. I forgot to talk about social poverty. I saw in Mexico and certain countries of Central America, where I used to go regularly for business, people who weren't satisfied after working for 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day with the money they got, they were tempted to go and work for gangs and drug cartels, working to protect drug shipments or becoming drug carriers. And given their lack of education, given their ability to think far enough because they lack assets and resources, they're thinking of the immediate future. Somebody has a child who is sick. Somebody has a wife who is not well. They need food. They want, like everyone else, to send their children to school and get a good education. But out of desperation, they turn to occupations that may be outside of the law. And that leads to very often to shootouts and confrontation with the armed forces, etc., which leads to more death. Now, what happens when a man decides he's going to do something that may be illegal, but he's doing it with good intentions to put food on the table for his hungry children and to get some medicines for his wife? And instead of being able to bring that money, somehow he gets caught in an altercation between gangs or between gangs and the law, and he gets killed. Now, what's the fate of the family that is left behind without the one breadwinner that they could have had? Is social poverty. The social component of poverty encompasses undervalued people groups, people with few or no rights, and people whose voices have been silenced. Sometimes it's just poor people in countries where the government doesn't have policies that reach them. At other times, it's tribals and other groups that live in jungles, in underdeveloped areas, and other places. In some countries, culture or government that devalues or ostracizes people, especially children of certain ethnic groups, cultivate social poverty. I'm sure all of you by now have heard what's happening in China with the Uyghurs. That is a group that the Chinese government is trying to re-educate, and they're trying to take away their identity. And they do it by creating social exclusion. And then if those people want a job or want an education, they've got to enter conversion programs where they are reoriented. Very often the families are separated. The children are taken away from the parents are put in camps where they have fixed jobs that they have to do. The children are put into schools where they're not allowed to speak their own language. They are taught the Chinese language. They're not allowed to practice whatever their cultural norms and social values were. So that is the social poverty, and what people have to suffer sometimes because of government policy, and other times it is by negligence and exclusion. There are many ways of measuring and categorizing poverty, but there is no simple unified definition. Previous two speakers spoke very eloquently and articulated this in many different ways. The United Nations observes that worldwide, frequently poverty is defined in either relative or absolute terms. Absolute poverty measures poverty in relation to the amount of money necessary to meet basic needs such as food, clothing, and shelter. Relative poverty defines poverty in relation to the economic status of other members of society. People are poor if they fall below prevailing standards of living in a given societal context. So poverty would be different in different countries. Here in the United States, for example, the Census Bureau defines poverty based on income, family size, age of family members. For instance, a family of 4 with 2 children would need to have an income of more than $24,000 a year to be considered above the poverty threshold. So in the US, if you're earning less than $24,000 a year, you are officially below the poverty, at the poverty line. If you're earning less than $24,000 a year, you are below the poverty line. Can we go to the next slide, please? What does the reach and impact of poverty look like? By the way, don't struggle to read that slide. I realize there's too much out there, but that slide will be available to you if you want. The World Health Organization says those living in poor conditions are exposed to greater personal and environmental health risks. They are less well-nourished and have less information and are less able to access healthcare. Thus, they have higher risk of illness and disability. Isn't it unfortunate that those of us who have resources, who come from good families, have a home to live in, parents have cars to send you to school in, you have a good education, you have all the gadgets you need, whether it's a phone, a laptop, you have 3 meals a day, and you have access to a doctor in case you fall sick, or a hospital in case you need to be hospitalized for something. But those that are poor and are more likely to need all these things are not able to have them. That is the impact, the reach and the impact of the poverty. In many locations, the effect of all this is pretty plain to see. Disease, despair, and lack of opportunity are the calling cards of the impact of poverty. And in other countries, it can sometimes be necessary to look a little closer. In communities all around the world, families are too often forced to decide between paying bills or buying food. Just think about that. If you have to worry about, do I have this little money, should I use it to buy food or should I use it to pay my bill? If I don't pay my electricity bill, my electricity gets cut off. Can I live in darkness? If you're in a country that has a severe winter, you won't have hot water to bathe. You need electricity for your electric hot water heaters. So what are you going to do? Are you going to use that money to buy food and then live in darkness and not bathe, be unhygienic? If you have a job and next day you go to work, people will say, hey, you're smelling. What's the matter with you? Or you pay your bills, be clean, bathe, look nice, wash your clothes, go to work. When you go to work hungry, and when you're hungry, your blood sugar is low, you're not productive. It can be a very, very difficult place. But that is the reach and the impact of poverty. Even though a family has a roof over their heads, doesn't mean it's a decent, safe, healthy, or affordable place for them to live. There are countries around the world, in Asia that I've seen, and in Central America as well, and South America, where you go to people's homes and there's pots and pans around there. Why? Because when it rains, it leaks through the roof and there's nothing they can do. They don't have the money to repair it, So they've just got to gather that leaking water and throw it out. That's just one. There's others where nowadays, because of climate change, you're seeing the oceans rise, you're seeing higher tides than before, and people living close to river banks and oceans see their houses getting flooded routinely. There were 2 startling statistics. Around the world, about 1 in 4 people lives in conditions that are harmful to their safety, their health, their prosperity, and opportunities. In the US, the Department of Housing and Urban Development says a family with 1 full-time worker earning a minimum wage cannot afford the local fair market rent. Think about it again, what I just said. In the US, a person working for $8 an hour, now it's $10 an hour in most cases. But if that man or woman has a family with 2 children, that income is not enough to feed their children and to pay the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment anywhere in the United States. So let's go to the next slide, please. The Sustainable Development Goals. I think Ms. Aishani spoke about this. And if you look at the first goal, it's no poverty. And then you look at all the other goals. Second goal is no hunger. Third is good health and well-being. The fourth is quality education. All these are things that we've talked about this morning. All 3 speakers today, including myself, Mr. Rieber, and Ms. Aishani, have spoken about these. By the way, what you're seeing is the Sustainable Development Goals were created in 2000 as the Millennial Development Goals. So these were supposed to be the UN goals, development goals for the start of the 21st century. And later, they modified these and called them the Sustainable Development Goals so they could be ongoing. Now, you can see for yourself in your own context. In Sri Lanka, there's been remarkable progress that has been made. In China, millions of people have come out of poverty. In India, millions of people have come out of poverty, and the Chinese and Indian economies are becoming global economies, like number 2 and number 3 after the United States. And yet, as one of the videos showed, there are more people today that have mobile phones than have a toilet to which to go to relieve themselves. Think of that paradox. What kind of a world have we created where technology has been commoditized, but health delivery and sanitation cannot be delivered to the people that need it? You look at all these goals from number 1 to number 17. If we achieve any of these goals with a good degree of success, it will help to reduce poverty tremendously. Whether it's climate action, life below water, life on land, though they may seem like they're not related to poverty, at the end of the day, whenever there is a disaster, whether it's man-made or it's natural, be it an earthquake or a hurricane, a blizzard, a flood, a drought, or a man-made disaster, whether it's a war, meltdown of a nuclear reactor somewhere, a collapse of infrastructure, oil tanker spilling oil somewhere in the ocean, all of these. Who gets impacted the most whenever there is a disaster, man-made or natural? It's the poor that are the most vulnerable. That's why they call them the most vulnerable sections of society. The next slide, please. So we talked about the multi-dimensional and multifaceted aspects of poverty, the UN development goals, the reach and impact of poverty. But let's look at the success stories. There are a number of initiatives around the world, not government initiatives, but private sector initiatives that have done extremely well and continue to do so. These are companies that didn't set up initiatives or plans to fight poverty after they made profits. That is good. That is corporate social responsibility. But there are companies that built in to their business strategy right from day one reasons to help the poor. The first one, Habitat for Humanity. This was an organization created by President Jimmy Carter of the United States. After he retired as president, he started something called Habitat for Humanity. And various companies from around the world and volunteer organizations will identify locations where people need better housing, and they go and build very modest houses for them, just 4 walls with concrete block and a roof that can withstand the elements, be it extreme sunlight, heavy rains, cold weather, or whatever. That was created by an ex-president. The next is, there's a company called Tom's Shoes. I don't know how many of you all have heard of Tom's Shoes. This was a company created by a young man called Blake Mycoskie. He had made money at a very young age. He invested well. He had some technology companies and startups. So he made his money, and he sold his company, took a lot of money, put it in the bank, was roaming around the world. And in places that he visited, he saw there were people working without shoes, young children, teenagers, grown-up people walking in the streets, walking through puddles of water, walking on hard stones and rocks and pebbles, etc. And while he was in Argentina and he was playing polo out there, he went to buy some shoes and he got an idea. He said he would start his own shoe company, and for every pair of shoes that they sold in a store or in a retail department store or boutiques or whatever, for each pair of shoes that the company sold, they would give away 1 pair of shoes to someone in need, be it a school child in a developing country or a third world country, or be it an old person, that was not working anymore, retired, and had limited resources. They even set up a factory for a short time in Haiti to make these shoes. They don't give away very expensive or stylish shoes, but they give away very basic shoes to the people in need. So for every pair of shoes that they make, they give away 1 pair of shoes, and that is paid for from the profits of the company. But that was their business strategy from day one. They didn't say, oh, when we reach $100 million then and we start making a good profit, then we're going to do this. No. He said, I'm going to start a company, I'm going to sell shoes. But for every pair of shoes that I sell, I'm going to give away 1 pair of shoes as a philanthropic effort. And that continues till today. The biggest market, by the way, for giveaway shoes is now school children. They decided that school children are growing, and every 6 months or so their feet are growing, and they need a new pair of shoes. So they make a very basic pair of shoes, which they give away to these school children. And then 6 months later, they go back, see what their new size is, and give them new shoes. Then there's a company called Bomba Socks. I don't think it's on that slide, but I just remembered and wanted to talk about it. Bomba Socks is, if any of you watch the show Shark Tank, Damon John was on that show. He owns this company, Bomba Socks, so he invested in it. And similar to Tom's Shoes, for each pair of socks that Bomba sells, they give away 1 pair of socks to someone in need. I just saw their ad yesterday saying they had given away 40 million pairs of socks. Two Blind Brothers is the next company I want to talk about briefly. This was a company created by 2 young men, their brothers, and they had an eye disease for which there was no cure. They were born with eyesight, which deteriorated gradually. They came from a family that was fairly wealthy, and they worked in the investment industry. They made money of their own, but then their eyesight deteriorated to the extent that they couldn't work anymore, and they knew this was going to happen. So what they did was they decided they would start this company called Two Blind Brothers. And this company sells clothing. I like to buy their clothes. They're a little more expensive than the normal clothes that you would buy in a department store, but I buy it because it helps the social cause. All the profits of that company, since they don't need the money, what they decided was they would run a business, but all the profits of that business would go to fund research to cure disease leading to blindness. Then there's Iron Fish. Iron Fish was more a social initiative. Somebody who made steel pans for cooking realized that in many developing countries and third world countries, the poorer people tend to be anemic. They don't have enough iron in their food. So he created this little fish, which is made of certain iron compounds, which you immerse in the pan when you're cooking. No matter what you cook, you don't have to cook just fish, whether it's vegetables, rice, or beans, or meat, or fish, or anything. You put this in, and it's built to give out the iron compound into the curry or sauce that you make, and that helps to provide nutrition, which creates more healthier people. So these are just a few. Another one that we shouldn't forget to mention, which was started in Bangladesh, was the Grameen Bank. And the founder of the Grameen Bank was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, or the Nobel Economic Prize, I think. I forget whether it was the Peace Prize or the Economic Prize. We have poor people around the world that I mentioned earlier are called unbankable. What is unbankable? They can't have a bank account either because there's some places you don't have a formal address, other places you don't have enough money, or you don't have the right credentials to be able to walk into a bank. You know, if you don't have a driver's license, you don't have a birth certificate, something to identify you, you cannot open a bank account. In many places, the poor people have various different obstacles. It's not just the lack of money. So what the Grameen Bank did was they went out into these poorer communities, in the slums, in the villages, wherever it was needed, and started helping people to form cooperatives and collectives. And they would give them small loans, sometimes as little as 200 rupees, to be able to start some micro industry, whether it's to make cookies and bag them or whatever. They would train the people. So groups of women would get together and start, whether it was weaving baskets, making product from coconut trees or grass or bamboo or whatever, or making meals and biscuits, and bagging them or whatever, you know. So the Grameen Bank slowly started teaching these people how to form an industry, how to repay the loan, how to keep books, how to do accounting. So it was not just about helping them to become bankable and build their financial credibility, but also teaching them to get organized and become self-sufficient and showing them a way out of poverty. There are many more success stories at Mashable.com. And I think I've given the link on this page, and also the organizers will be sharing this link with you. So can we go to the next slide? So here were just some pictures of the success stories from the previous page and others. At the top left, you can see a very cheap tricycle that was developed for handicapped people to be able to get around. This was somewhere in West Africa. On the top right-hand side was a cooler developed in the Philippines, a very cheap cooler. Now you can look at the house, it's a zinc sheet wall, so it must be very hot. And in the summer, it would get almost unbearable. So they use this thermocol sheet and they take plastic bottles. Those plastic bottles are drilled, screwed into the holes that are drilled previously, and they have water connections. And it works on a combination of convection and conduction and creates a cooling effect. So the inside is almost 10 degrees cooler than the outside. It's a very primitive water cooler principle. On the bottom left-hand side, this is a tube with an ultra filter inside it. It allows children to be, or anybody, not just children, people can use this tube to drink water from a source of water that might not otherwise be used for drinking. The filter removes 99.9% of all the impurities. So if you're stuck somewhere in an emergency without clean water, or the bottles of drinking water you have are finished, this is something that could allow you to safely drink water without harming your health. The hand holding the little red device. This was, I think many of you have seen devices like this, which can be used to track items that are lost. But this is not the same. This was different. This was a device that contains iodine. Iodine is something that is also lacking in people who have malnourishment or undernourishment. And it's usually in people suffering from poverty that you have undernourished or malnourished people. So using this or wearing it on your skin releases iodine into the skin and allows you to enjoy better health. Again, something to help. All of these, if you look at them, are instruments or initiatives that would allow people to lift themselves out of poverty. On the last bottom right-hand side, many people have to walk miles a day with a couple of pots on their head or on their waist to pick up water and come back home with that water. What you see there is a roller. It's a barrel called a hippo. And it's got this thing that allows you to push it along. It carries anywhere from 40 to 50 liters of water. Women can fill it. And now it's not a load that they have to lift, but you just push it along and take it. They're called the hippo rollers. So you've seen there are many success stories. There are many initiatives, grassroots initiatives where people are doing well. And I hope this will inspire you, motivate you. You must be congratulated for putting this event together. It shows that you have the motivation, the commitment, the engagement to be able to do something. So with that, I'd like to end with a thank you to everybody. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you, and I hope you will make a positive difference in the world. The future rests on your shoulders. And from what I've seen today, I'm confident you will live up to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bissar. Indeed, you have inspired us to be the voice for the poor. Sadly, all good things have to come to an end. Unfortunately, of course. And now I would like to invite one of our project chairs, Ahmed Mukta, to give the vote of thanks.
Good evening, Warden Sir, Sub-Warden Sir, Father Roshan, distinguished guest speakers, invited students, club members, and my fellow Grameeners. It is with immense pleasure that I deliver the vote of thanks on this enlightening evening on behalf of the entire club. As co-project chairperson, I would like to thank our panel of distinguished guest speakers for sharing their time and knowledge to help us understand the issues we face and how we as the youth can play a critical part in resolving them in the future. I would also like to thank our teacher in charge and executive committee members for giving us their maximum support when it was most needed to guarantee the success of this event. I would also like to thank my fellow committee members who worked day and night to ensure that UN Day 2021 would be one to remember. Finally, on behalf of the United Nations Club of St. Thomas's, I wish everyone all the very best. Stay home, stay safe. Thank you, Estover Pedro.
That brings us to the end of UN Day 2021, Fight Poverty, Not the Poor. I hope you were inspired to fight against poverty, not the poor, to fight against the real cause for poverty. Have a good night, and we hope you would have a great week ahead of you.